Ladies, gentlemen, and exiles of all ages, after a busy week, I've breached into the endgame with my lightning invoker setup. For those who are aware of my original build plans, we got hit extremely hard by the recent patch that nerfed trigger skills, and cast on shock and cast on crit are really not great right now outside of specifically boss fights after these changes. But the results of this are of course some refiddling with the concept, some moving things around, some changes being made, and after a lot of gold spent in a few exalted orbs, I've got something quite strong without any use of trigger skills to begin with, and still keeping it at least mostly similar actual playstyle to our original early game invoker build. But to put it simply, today we're going to go over what I'm currently doing in the early stages of the proper endgame of Path of Exile 2 with my invoker monk, how I'm using it to burst the hell out of tier 3 maps, pretty much one-shotting everything that isn't a rare or a boss, and then still decking the floor with those even so. The survivability of this build is pretty reasonable. We have a lot of evasion and reasonable energy shield, and importantly for most combat we have a lot of range, considering that we are a quote-unquote melee class. And the skills are all technically melee skills too. So what are the big things going on here that make this so smooth, so comfortable and enjoyable to play? First up, we've got the Combat Frenzy Resonance tech. I first heard of this from Neversink, just to credit the tech itself, but the idea is that you use Combat Frenzy as a persistent buff skill to generate frenzy charges every time that you freeze, electrocute, or pin an enemy, but we don't really do that. We do the electrocuting and the freezing though, so that's quite nice. And then you pair that with the Resonance passive in the passive tree, which changes which charges count as which, and essentially lets you generate power charges from electrocuting or freezing enemies, both of which this build does quite a large amount of. We use this to basically just passively generate these power charges, and then we use the charges on Charged Staff as a skill for bonus projectiles from all of our attacks, and a significant damage increase while it's active as well. This also gives us more hits, generally speaking, larger range, better cleave, and more ability to trigger Tempest Bell for our proper burst stages of gameplay too. Outside of this, the most unusual part of this setup is that we rely on freezes as a concept without using any cold damage skills or even any support gems to change the damage type of a different skill into being cold damage. Instead, we just get flat cold damage on a couple pieces of equipment, we take a couple of choice passives in the tree to give us more cold damage, and then we can freeze enemies relatively potently and easily with something as simple as Stormwave, our main ranged attack, which is a lightning attack, and therefore the end result, just very simply, is a ton of frozen things, a ton of electrocuted enemies not being able to move, and in general just being in a vulnerable position, and we have ridiculous amounts of burst damage potential through Tempest Flurry and Tempest Bell, especially as we have the ability to put two bells down at the same time if the stars happen to align and the positioning works out in a boss fight. And nothing will burst something down faster than having two Tempest Bells being spammed into at the same time, really. All that said, let's dive into the skill gems that we use and the support gems that we have inside of them, any specifics of how we actually use these skills together past what I've already spoken about here. We'll talk about any swaps that I might make in the future, then we'll go into our Ascendancy Points, our passive skill tree so far, and then just a talk about equipment itself, what I've got and what my goals are to improve it, and what it would be in an ideal scenario as well, really. First up then, the skill gems themselves. Tempest Flurry up here mostly exists for single target damage and funneling into Tempest Bell. The most important part of this is the speed of the hits, but the damage does matter quite a lot as well, of course. As a result, I've currently got the Martial Tempo support in here for bonus attack speed, Primal Armament support for 25% bonus elemental damage in general with this attack, and Close Combat for bonus damage in close range. This is a melee skill, so most times that we actually care about the damage of it, past just using it for Charged Staff Electrocute procs, this will be active by default because we will be in close range. If I had another support gem slot in this actual skill, that would either go to Inspiration for cost reduction of the skill, or if mana was still fine at that point, then Super Critical for bonus critical damage with the skill at the cost of lower crit chance. If I had the full 5 slots, both of those would be the things going in. After that, we have the main synergy for that skill, which is Tempest Bell as well. After building up to a 4 melee hit combo, this lets you drop the bell down on the ground. It takes damage from your hits and echoes damage out around it each time that it is struck. It can take ailment buildup and then applies that ailment with its hits afterwards as well. This gives us a really strong synergy in itself, as Tempest Bell is possibly the easiest target to apply your ailments on to begin with, and you can apply Freeze on Tempest Bell to actually activate your first power charge through Combat Frenzy, after which they just sort of keep coming and keep rolling because we'll have Charged Staff active, passively generating from our setup. In Tempest Bell, the supports that I've got for this are Rage for 3 rage generated on melee hit, which the bell's echoes do count for. Rage gives us attack speed and we stack it up from this. Attack speed gives us faster bell hits, so this just stacks really quickly to give us a fair bit of power when the bell gets whipped out. We also have Lightning Infusion for 25% bonus lightning damage from the bell at the cost of other damage types coming from it, and this is the main damage type we will be doing through this. this. Then we also have overabundance, and this lets you have 2 bells out at the same time, but with 50% less duration. The duration for the skill normally is 6 seconds, but especially with Tempest Flurry beating into it and rage being generated and our general attack speed being increased in general, you can easily hit the point where the bell breaks before the duration ends, and this support gem here lets you not only build up the combo for a bell while a bell is already deployed, so you can remove downtime on the bell in a stationary fight, but when you get freeze or electrocute or a stun off on a boss or something like that, you can chain hits together fast enough to put both bells out at the same time, which is just absolutely insane for our burst damage. With more support slots in here, I'd say put in concentrated effect for a smaller area of effect on the bell's pulse, but larger damage output from it, as if you are using this, it's normally at melee range anyways. Next up then, we've got the Stormwave skill, which is our main sort of map clearing ability. Outside of rares or bosses, you don't really ever need to step into melee range, because this does the job excellently. It's just safer to fire this off from a distance. In Stormwave, we have the long shot support for increased damage from further away with this attack, as well as magnified effect for increased area, which makes the range longer. These things sort of go together to make it just much easier to hit with the sort of sweet spot distance for the damage for Stormwave, and keep things far away from us whilst doing a lot of damage to them. We also then have the Ice Bite support here, which makes our attacks gain 35% of damage as cold damage after freezing an enemy with this skill. This is our highest best freeze applying skill in general. It is our general mob clearing ability, so we will be killing with it as well, and so we often activate this by freezing with Stormwave itself, which then adds more cold damage to Stormwave and makes it easier to freeze things as well. Then we have Charge Staff, our sort of skill that we want to have as a permanent full uptime buff to not only add a lot of flat lightning damage to our attacks because it gives us flat damage per charge, but also add a shockwave effect to give range to things like Tempest Flurry and otherwise fully melee attack. What makes this strong though specifically for our setup is the support gems that I've got in here. The way that the skill works, when you activate it, it consumes power charges and gains 6 seconds of duration per power charge consumed. We stick in the persistent support gem to increase this amount of time by 40%. Then we have Electrocute, which makes lightning damage from this skill contribute to Electrocute buildup, and then Neural Overload, which makes hits from this apply Electrocute to primed enemies and just activate it instantly, which means that it will apply the Electrocute early depending on the enemy rarity, scaling from applying it at 40% buildup on normal enemies up to 80% on bosses, but it does make quite a big difference and it helps us get our charges rolling even more frequently. This contributes to our consistent power charge generation through the method that we talked about earlier, because once you start a map by getting a freeze, you have 1 power charge to activate the skill to begin with. Then once that is active, you can just apply Electrocute from range for free every few seconds to extend the duration and stack more flat lightning damage buffs. And the fun part is, even if you just spend 1 power charge at a time, if you do it before the buff falls off, it will actually continue stacking upwards and upwards until the maximum flat lightning damage buff that the skill can reach, dependent on your maximum power charges, so it is really quite potent. Then we have Combat Frenzy, our first persistent buff, and this one has one simple job: generate frenzy charges when we freeze or electrocute enemies, which we then convert into power charges through our skill tree. Inside of this, we have Precision as a support gem for increased accuracy while the skill is active, which is always, though if you are lacking in spirit, you don't need to have this, it is just useful. Then we also have Profusion, which is very important, and it gives the skill a 50% chance of generating 2 charges instead of 1 when it does trigger. After that, we have Wind Dancer as our next persistent buff. This is a really strong defensive spirit skill. Every 1.5 seconds that you aren't hit by an attack, you gain 1 stage of this buff, which is 16% more evasion rating, stacking on top of itself each time up to 3 maximum stages. When you are hit by a melee attack, you lose all stacks and knock back nearby enemies. For the most part, this just gives you a ton of bonus evasion, which is great, but if you do get melee hit and trigger the knockback, it's not unlikely that it will help you and save you from getting surrounded by multiple enemies in the process and keeping you from dying. Inside of this, we have similarly helpful utilities such as Wind Wave to apply knockback to enemies whenever we are stunned from this, which again helps stop from being surrounded at any point, and then Maim, so whenever an enemy does trigger this by hitting us with a melee, they get slowed and have reduced accuracy, and this mostly applies to things like rares or bosses, things that will be attacking in close range for more prolonged periods of time. Then we have our other survival persistent buff, which is Ghost Dance. This essentially makes it so you gain energy shield whenever you get hit. The energy shield gain is related to your evasion stat, and it does of course also have a limit to how frequently this can trigger, of course, how often you get the stacks, but the idea is that this gives you an extra defensive layer if something were to break through your evasion to keep you nice and healthy. Inside of this, we have Fast Forward for 30% less duration. This specifically in this spot makes it energy shield recharge from this skill happen faster. Then Clarity for increased mana regeneration while it's active, and again, this is permanently active, so that's just permanent mana regeneration. Following that, we basically just have some more uses for spirit that we've got here, with our last 2 skill slots being the ones that I would cut out if you have less spirit than I do. mostly because they are offensively based, and we need the survival and utility of the others up until this point. That said, we have the Herald of Thunder to create lightning bolts from our attacks after we kill shocked enemies. Inside of this, we have Innervate for a bonus 35% of damage as lightning damage after the lightning bolt from this kills a shocked enemy, which will happen relatively frequently when just clearing general mobs. Then of course, Coursing Current, which makes shock applications from this skill have a chance to also apply them in an area around the target. Then finally, we have Herald of Ice, and this just causes a bonus cold damage explosion whenever you kill a frozen enemy with a melee hit. Inside of this, the only support gem that I currently have is Blind, just to lower the accuracy and evasion of enemies when you're fighting against larger groups. Generally speaking, the way this all sort of folds together is you have 4 active skill buttons. The rest all just happen passively in the background. Stormwave is used for general mob clearing, applying shocks and freezes from range, which gives us power charges. Then you use Charge Staff to turn the power charges into bonus lightning damage and activate our ability to electrocute enemies, and anytime that you electrocute, you gain more power charges to make Charge Staff just fully self-sufficient. Then when you are up against rare enemies that need a bit more damage put in, or things like bosses, you whack them with Tempest Flurry 4 times, stick down the bell, whack the bell 4 times, stick down another bell, and repeat this until the enemy is dead. The only real trick to it past that is learning how to position yourself so that Tempest Flurry hits both the enemy and the bell with its own cleave, as this basically multiplies your damage if you can get the right position with it. Past that, let's move on and talk about our passive skill tree, starting of course with the Ascendancy Points themselves. Currently, I do have only 4 myself. The first 2 went into Sunder My Enemies over here, as critical hits ignoring elemental resistances is an extremely strong way to remove any potential weaknesses. Then the next 2 that I have in right now are in Chill Effect for increased magnitude of chill, but then also I Am the Blizzard. This gives you 10% of all damage you do as extra cold damage, which is very useful for triggering our freezes, and also whenever you freeze an enemy, you create Chilled Ground, which is a ground effect that will just apply chill to enemies that are standing in it, again helping us actually achieve our general goals of dealing cold damage and freeze to activate our other effects. Past this, if I were to have the points 5 and 6 or 7 and 8, 5 and 6 would go into Evasion Energy Shield here for just a good layer of bonus defensives, and then also lead me through Grace, which gives us bonus spirit for each energy shield or evasion rating on your body armor slot, but stops you from gaining spirit from your equipment. Currently, I am achieving my spirit skills through a spirit roll on both my amulet and my body armor, but if you just get a nice solid evasion-centric chess piece and get this node in your Ascendancy Points, you will actually have a ton of spirit to work with as an Invoker Monk, and it frees up modifier space on your equipment for other, more potentially useful stats. The last 2 points then that I want to mess with more when I actually reach them, but the most likely option is going to be going into And I Shall Rage to get Unbound Avatar later on. This just gives us an extra skill, which basically gives us a form that we can enter that gives us bonus elemental damage and ailments. You can enter this form when you apply elemental damage and ailments, so all of this just completely works around what we're already basing our damage off of and our build off of in the first place, so it makes just a lot of sense to just go further into it and make everything that we're doing even better. With that covered then, let's move on to the full passive tree. This is absolutely a work in progress. I continually am spending gold trying out slight variations along the path and then refunding back to other choices, but I'm quite happy with where I am right now and where I plan to take this as we move forward and get more points too. That said, we start by heading through the evasion and energy shield side of the beginning area here over to Step Like Mist. This gives you bonus movement speed, which is really important, but it also gives you increased mana regeneration, increased dexterity, and intelligence. While we're here, what we do is we grab a faster energy shield recharge start and also increase stun threshold while at full life, which helps quite a bit with not being hit with Mystic Stance here over on the right. Beside this, we also grab Essence of the Mountain and the thing before it to get extra freeze buildup, and also just gain damage as cold damage in general, which again helps us apply freeze to enemies in the first place. We then wrap around through Mindful Awareness for increased evasion rating and energy shield over to Flow Like Water, which gives us bonus attack speed, which is very important, as well as increased dexterity and intelligence. Here we go up 2 paths here. On the left side, we pick up some shock chance as well as some extra damage as lightning damage in general, some more shock chance, but then on the inner track, we grab crit chance, and then increased damage just as a whole if you have dealt a critical hit in the last 8 seconds, and we do build around crit a lot, so this will be active and give us a nice damage increase. After this, we're going to be going through some attribute nodes here, over and up to Moment of Truth. Through here gives us a lot of critical damage and crit chance, and it also gives us a bonus to critical damage if you've dealt a non-critical hit recently, which of course we do. We even have things like super critical, which we are going to put into Tempest Flurry eventually for when we have higher crit chance, so that we can make sure that we always have this damage bonus active regardless. Then we go up through some attribute nodes here, and it's important to note that for the most part, the things that you want to actually focus in your attribute nodes are just meeting the requirements of everything you have. Make sure you meet the requirements of our gear, make sure you meet the requirements of our skills, and then past that, you mostly want to stack dexterity for the plans that I have currently. Until you reach a certain skill node, you actually do want some intelligence as well because it doesn't hurt to have, but eventually the plan is to have most of it converted to dexterity. We go up here then to this nice elemental damage cluster. We grab a bunch of just increased elemental damage in general, but then we also get Echoing Frost, which gives us increased elemental damage if we've recently chilled an enemy. We do that quite easily and frequently, so that's just bonus damage. Then we pick up Echoing Thunder, and this is the exact same thing, but if you've shocked an enemy recently, and again, a lot of our damage is lightning damage, we apply a lot of shock as a result. Then if I had a few more points, at least at the immediate moment, what I would do here is go wrapping around here and over to get to the power charge increasing nodes here. What this does is give you a lot of bonus energy shield if you have recently consumed a power charge, but then also it gives you +1 to your maximum power charges, which means a higher cap of the amount of flat lightning damage that you can gain from activating charged staff, and then also 5% chance to actually gain maximum power charges whenever you would gain any power charges. Obviously a 5% chance isn't particularly high, but the idea is that sometimes you'll just get full stacks, and this will just be really effective and useful for you. Past this, what we do actually have already, because we've got the points for it, is more mana regeneration and lower mana cost of skills over here with conservative casting. Then we go up and around here to get to resonance. We talked about this one earlier. It is very, very important. It helps us change those frenzy charges from combat frenzy into being power charges, which is very, very useful for us. We then go up through a jewel socket, and here I've got just increased melee damage, but for the most part, the things that you actually want to do with your jewels, if you do have a personal choice, if you do have like a lot to choose from, is things like evasion rating increases, crit damage bonuses, or elemental damage bonuses with any of these slots. Then we head up and over the top to get to some bonus evasion rating and increased maximum energy shield, which is quite useful. Of course, it helps us stack our defensives and makes us a lot tankier. Then we also grab attack speed, and then deep trance, which gives us attack speed, and also reduced cost of skills, which is also quite useful. This is one of the points that I want to come back to when I have more skill points later on, and just put in all of these nodes here. There's a ton of crit chance, a ton of crit damage that you can get in here, even some intelligence, which is quite nice, just a bunch of bonus damage. It's just really good for a crit-based setup, and a lot of our setup is based around crit, so that is quite useful. Then we go up here and around to get some more evasion and energy shield nodes, which is very useful for our survivability, as well as, importantly, +1 to maximum energy shield per 12 evasion rating on equipped body armor. Through this node, something we'll be taking later on, and the Ascendancy node that we talked about, where you get Spirit for the evasion rating on your body armor, we essentially have the goal of just creating a very high evasion rating chest piece to make us have a lot of benefits from this, and this is one of the components of that synergy. Then we also grab Shadow Dancing, and this gives you an increased evasion rating if you've been hit recently, which is just generally useful, but also a faster start of energy shield recharge if you have recently been stunned as well. Then we head out and we get another jewel socket here before forking off into this little lightning path for bonus lightning damage in general, as well as an increase to the maximum lightning damage roll potential. Then we take all of these power charge based nodes. This gives you increased critical damage if you've recently consumed a power charge. We consume power charges regularly and we like crits, so that's excellent, but then this also just gives us 2 bonus maximum power charges, which again gives us more flat lightning damage potential from charged staff. We then go outside and down the actual edge of the skill tree itself over to this just massive lovely section of quarterstaff based nodes. All of these things increase your potency with a quarterstaff. It increases your offense, increases crit, it increases your actual ability to positively gain with charged staff through this, one with the storm passive right here, which makes quarterstaff skills count as consuming bonus power charges when you actually do consume them. As well, there are things like knockbacks, there's increased attack speed, which is lovely, there's increased freeze buildup, ailment buildup in here. It is just really, really useful of a tree, and if I had more skill points, I would definitely be filling out the ones that I don't have here as well, because even these are extremely good as well. Then we head down into another jewel socket into the last sort of points that I have spent right now, because this is what I've got, and I put these into a few more evasion points over here, leading to bestial skin. This gives you 100% increased evasion rating from your equipped body armor. So basically, this is the final piece of the sort of synergy to having a very high evasion body armor. We want to build an evasion body armor. It will give us a bunch of energy shield. It'll have its evasion rating doubled from this, which also will then give us bonus spirit from our ascendancy points that we'll have later on too. Aside from this, the things that I would want to do if I had more points, at least the things that I'm immediately planning, are things like the Coming Calamity cluster over here, which gives you a bunch of increased damage when you have Herald skills equipped. We have Herald of Ice and Herald of Thunder equipped and active, which means this would give us 50% increased cold damage and 50% increased lightning damage, which is a lot of value. Not to mention that you can also reduce the reservation costs of the Herald skills, which could even let you potentially work in another spirit skill once everything is said and done. As well, there are more nodes over here, like a bunch of increased crit chance and crit damage, as well as just increased base crit chance, which is a very, very powerful node to have for a crit-based setup. There's things like here where you can get bonus electrocute buildup. We focus around electrocute, so this is useful. And we also could get an increased 20% damage damage taken debuff on enemies that we electrocute, which essentially just makes us do more damage for doing the things that we already are. The final thing that I sort of have my eye on right now is over here, which is Falcon Technique. This gives you 1% increased attack speed per 15 dexterity you have. If you were to stack a reasonably decent amount of dexterity, this could give us a lot of extra attack speed, which could make all of our damage just come out way faster and way more potently, to the point where Tempest Flurry and Tempest Bell could just absolutely obliterate things that are much more difficult than what I'm fighting against right now. And the idea is, once you get this node, you would swap over all of your excess intelligence into more dexterity just to actually fuel this and make it stronger. Finally then, today let's talk about gear. I will show you what I've got, the things that made each item worth taking for me, and why I choose to build it up the way that I did. We'll also talk about any changes that I would make to these items if I could have any modifiers in the world. As well, I'm not using any uniques right now, but there is one that you could use with this build, which I will mention as we get to it as well. First up then, for the weapon, you just want a big, meaty, physical damage stick. This converts into elemental damage through our skills to begin with, so stack a bunch of physical damage and watch them go burr into either cold or lightning damage depending on what you're doing. The bonus stats that we have on this are just that, they're a bonus, they aren't the things that I was after. The main goal was purely physical damage stacking on this. In a perfect world, if I had a really good choice over the other modifiers, it would have also had bonus attack speed, as attack speed is very powerful for us, and it would have something like flat lightning damage increase and general elemental damage increase too. For your body armor slot, once you have the Ascendancy node that we talked about earlier, to upgrade to the scaling spirit with body armor stats, you would want to switch to a pure evasion body armor. I don't have that now because I don't have the Ascendancy node. But until then, and for every other one of your slots, you want a mixed evasion energy shield base armor piece. For armor and jewelry in general, your priority is sorting out your resistances. This lowers most damage in the game by a ton. Outside of resistances, getting bonuses to things like evasion rating to stack onto our passive skill tree buffs, and then maximum life, as more maximum life is just a larger overall pool underneath all of our other defensive layers. On your rings and gloves specifically, you want to aim for flat bonus cold damage. This is where we get the majority of our freeze buildup potential, is by adding cold damage onto all of our attacks purely through our gear here, and then amplifying it through some of our skill tree choices, which lets us apply freeze, which lets us generate power charges, let's just use charge staff, and then apply electrocute. So this is where a lot of our sort of power comes from, without having to work in a freeze skill to our actual skill gem slots. You can also roll attack speed on your gloves, so that is again quite important. The alternative here, if you consider it easier to use a unique instead of building all this freeze and cold damage in, would be the Katoko's current gloves, which makes all lightning damage have electrocute buildup to begin with. If you do this, you would also want to remove a lot of the cold or freeze based parts of the rest of the setup, but it pretty much changes the build entirely if you do that. It's just something that was worth mentioning for anyone who's curious about the concepts. Then specifically for boots, only for boots, above all else, the thing that you want on boots is increased movement speed. Anything else is just a bonus, especially as you get into the endgame. This becomes more and more important because you can roll up to like 30% movement speed increase on your boots, and if you want to survive in the endgame of this game, there is not a single stat more important than movement speed on your boots. Movement speed lets you evade mechanics, it lets you dodge even auto attacks from monsters, and even the speed that you move while attacking is relative to your movement speed stat. So movement speed as a stat is just massively important. That just about does it for today then, everyone. A sort of roundup of where I am currently at in my journey as an Invoker monk trying to call every monster in the world with the elements, ripping up the earth and slamming bells down in to patch it up. I hope you've all enjoyed the video, and I hope you enjoy using this build if you try it for yourself too. Like if you liked the video, subscribe to the notification bell for more, and most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, until next time, stay sweet.
Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world our stage. Goodbye.